All right. Thank you for joining us for MSU Comics Forum 2021 online day two. This is for joining us for MSU Comics Forum. Who is doing that? That's not me. Hmm. All right. I am honored to welcome a great panel on LGBTQ issues in comics. I want to thank Andre Carrington for his work organizing this panel. We reached out to him and he took the lead in bringing together a really dynamic group of scholars and practitioners to talk about a very important issue in terms of representation in comics. So I'm going to get off the screen and allow Andre to take over. Again, thank you so much, Andre, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Julian. Welcome everyone viewing us on the YouTube stream right now, and those of you who tuned in as participants via the webinar link. I'm Andre Carrington. I'm Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and I am geeked. I am just queerly geeked to be in conversation with a wonderful group of people today. If you have questions throughout our discussion, there is a Q&A on the webinar stream, and there's also a chat box where conversation's been ongoing along with the YouTube stream. So this conversation is a roundtable on LGBTQA plus comics issues. And we are LGBTQA plus comics people. So it's a really exciting way for us to be in conversation with each other and with everyone out there about what's queer about the comic stuff that we do and how we as queers in comics and queers about comics geek out together about it. This will be a roundtable. There are some initial questions I have for every participant here. And after introducing everyone, I'm going to give everyone a chance to weigh in on what I think is one of the main questions anchoring us to this conversation and putting us in community. To start with, I want to introduce our panelists. And to do that, I'm going to do a little screen sharing magic. It's not magic. I think everyone now knows what's actually involved. Our first panelist, Margaret Galvin, is an assistant professor of visual rhetoric in the Department of English at the University of Florida. She's finishing a book, Invisible Archives of the 1980s, Feminist Politics and Queer Platforms, with University of Minnesota Press, which examines how publishing practices and archives have shaped understandings of the visual within feminist and queer activism. This coming fall, she'll be an external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center, researching her second book about how American LGBTQ cartoonists in the 80s and 90s formed community through comics. What a great subject. Her published work, which analyzes comics and social movements, can be found in American Literature, Archive Journal, Australian Feminist Studies, Inc.'s Journal of Comic Studies, the Journal of Lesbian Studies, and Women's Studies Quarterly. See margaretgalvin.org for more information. Thank you so much for joining us. Moving along, our next panelist is Nick Gitau, whose silly but actually also serious bio identifies her as president of the board of Geeks Out. Long a fan of Geeks Out's work, Nicole began volunteering with the organization in 2012. Since then, she has served as web editor, vice president, and from 2018, president. Geeks Out, the organization that presents FlameCon, as you see in the graphic. As a librarian and tech researcher, Nick Gutow counts Barbara Gordon and Jenny Calendar among their fandom inspirations. I think that's actually super relevant information to know about, so I'm glad that I use the fun bio and not just the very serious work bio that usually we rely on. Mariko Tamaki is author of Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, among other texts. She is an Eisner Award winner. Oh my gosh, I'm having a little bio anxiety. Nope, we're back. Winner of the Eisner Award in 2019 and author for DC and Marvel Comics titles such as Detective Comics and Wolverine. She is editor of the imprint Shirley Books for Abrams Press and also author of This One Summer and Skim. And Justin Hall is the Fulbright Scholar of Comics and Associate Professor of Comics at California College of Arts and co-founding organizer of the Queers in Comics Conference and a board member of Prism Comics. He's editor of the Lambda Award-winning and Eisner-nominated No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics, which he's producing as the feature-length documentary film No Straight Lines. Recently, he conceived and co-edited the anthology Theater of Terror, Revenge of the Queers. He curated the first museum show of LGBTQ comics at the San Francisco Cartoon Art Museum, as well as co-curating the largest show of queer comics at the Schwulz Museum in Berlin. So what I would like to do is to give the floor to each of you in order, Margaret, then Nick, then Mariko, and then Justin, to answer a question that I think is really relevant to all of what we do among the diverse ways that we engage with queer stuff and comics, which are also queer stuff. And that question for each of you is, how do comics put you in community with other people through the kind of work that you do in your engagement with comics as an art form?
So
I'll start with you, Maggie.
Sure. Can you actually share the screen with the image again, if
Yes.
possible?
Yes.
Because I was gonna sort of talk through the image.
I love it.
Okay, so all of my work in comics is really about sort of community building and how LGBTQ cartoonists, built networks together. I looking particularly at the 80s and 90s as an overlooked moment of community building that led to an explosion of titles, artists, publications as folks came together through series like Gay Comics, which was a long-running series from 1980 through 1998, and that they were able to share resources and ideas through these different platforms. A lot of the innovations in this era laid the groundwork for the explosion of queer comics that we're seeing today. So for instance, some quick remarks, seeing gay comics in the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop in the West Village is what inspired Alison Bechdel to start cartooning. And this series was often the first place where emerging cartoonists published outside of their local communities and grassroots publications and started to get a broader audience. So in the image above, you see Gay Comics number 25 at the very top, which is the final issue of this series from 1998 that collects together new comics by many of the 100+ contributors, as many of them as possible, and also includes statements by the 3 editors, Howard Cruz, Robert Triptow, and Andy Mangels, as well as bios about each of the contributors. The bios are especially key parts of the history. And I had undergrad students last spring in a queer comics class work on improving the Wikipedia presence for LGBTQ cartoonists in this era. Before they started, only 47 of the 104 artists, that's 45%, had biographies on Wikipedia at all. As of the project's completion, they'd improved 21 bios and created 9 new entries, collectively adding over 200,000 characters to Wikipedia. And they're super invested in this, but there's more work to be done. For instance, Burton Clark, who's an important Black queer artist, my student who was working on him was told by Wikipedia that he was not notable enough to have a biography on Wikipedia, which is a huge problem. So we need to get Burton Clark up there. So they're like also, this is just not Wikipedia, it's comics histories in general. And I love Justin Hall's work on this. You call it a parallel universe alongside the rest of comics, which is where queer comics artists produce in grassroots periodicals with independent non-comics publishers and self-published comics and zines. So I've gathered this photo has those examples there. You have examples of people who produced in newspapers, then in gay comics and in publications of their own. The best one on here is Andrea Natalie's The Night Audrey's Vibrator Spoke from 1992, best title ever, I would say. You also see these like slim horizontal volumes by folks like Rupert Kinnard, Donnellan, and Enley Dunlap, which sort of echo the fact that they're first producing stuff in newspapers. It's newspaper strips. There's also a number of zines I've included here. So we have Leanne Franson, some Rob Kirby and David Kelly. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't include Hothead Paisan. I mean, you also have interconnected networks here. So Deanne DeMassa, who did Hothead Paisan, also published Rob Kirby's Strange Looking Exile under her Giant Ass Publishing imprint. I always make sure I have to say the best parts of these things. So Giant Ass Publishing, great publishing house. So a lot of these comics are sometimes, these are like, out of print, but also the grassroots publications are hard to get to, but a lot more are becoming digitized. So the comics are becoming more available, but they're not always text searchable. I've been digging with a class this semester through the grassroots publications, and they've been finding all of these comics of all these cartoonists that I don't know the names of, or I'm not familiar with the work. So it convinces me more and more and more that we really need like an index to chart a lot of this history of how queer cartoonists were so part of social movements. And so, I just want to end by saying, it's the relationships in the work is really important, but also like the scholarship depends on like relationships with people. A lot of what I understand about the lesbian comics movement in the 90s comes from Jennifer Camper, who is super generous and let me look through her personal files and look through her copies of the Lesbian Cartoonist Network, which was a newsletter that Andrea Natalie started in the 90s. I mean, the artists themselves, because they're marginalized especially and couldn't depend on anyone else to care, were responsible for stewarding the histories of this community. And so it's really, important to sort of, look to their work. And I have a few of those histories, Gay Comics from 1989, which is Robert Triptow's. Also Dyke Strippers from 1995 is a great sort of featuring of lesbian cartoonists, but I'll just sort of leave it there. So I just want to show you some of this work because it's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is beautiful. And thanks for reminding us, Giant Ass Publishing. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Next, Nick Gitau.
So I didn't prepare anything nearly as thorough and engaging, of which I think kind of speaks to my work. Fly by the seat of my pants. So I think in response to the question of how does comics, what is my community in comics? I think sort of before talking about like the work that I am currently doing, I think it's kind of to give you a good, to give the context for what I'm doing now. I think it's probably worth me mentioning how I got started. I got started doing, I guess, as a queer comics organizer, because I realized that I liked comics and I didn't have a community for that. And both, it's funny, before joining Geeks Out as volunteer, I read comics and I had queer friends, but those two groups did not overlap. And so being the librarian that I am, I was like, I'm going to research this. There's got to be some, and I'm in New York, there's got to be some group of people where this overlaps. So yeah, I started doing the work because of a personal interest, and then I found that it was really rewarding. So right now, as mentioned earlier, I'm president of Geeks Out. We are a nonprofit that in a typical year, we attend conventions across the country, and we host our own convention, FlameCon, based in New York. And obviously that has changed. The convention scene has changed a lot in the last year, or lack thereof. But really, I see the work that I do as building the space where these, the connections that Margaret was talking about, where these networks can either, physically, where people can come face to face with each other. That's going to look a lot different for us. And I think for a lot of our communities are moving online, that certainly can change, who's accessing those communities and maybe segment some of the conversations we're having. But I'm really excited to build a space that people can, build their own community and build their own work. Before things get to the archives, they have to be produced, and things. I want to create a space where people are sharing ideas freely. So that's my background and how I think about community.
Thanks so much. Okay, moving forward, our next panelist, Mariko Tamaki.
Hello. You don't have to keep the book there. You can. Actually, it's hard because I don't have my glasses on, so everything is really small and blurry. So yes. So I guess my connection to community in relation to queer comics, I mean, it's kind of ironic, really, because I came from a very an amazing community of queer artists. Like, really, in Montreal, Canada, where I went to university at McGill, I had this very strong sort of like my queer university group was very sort of arts oriented. And when I moved back to Toronto, Canada, everybody that I knew was part of this sort of small queer community. A lot of it was sort of formed around Buddies in Bad Times Theatre, which is a Toronto queer theatre, which is actually, I think, still one of the few, if not only, queer theaters that has its own venue. So I grew up with queer artists and was really sort of molded out of that. I was part of the queer theater community. I was part of a queer publishing community, although not comics, mostly prose, working for Women's Press. Was one of my first jobs. And I think the thing is I was reading queer comics. I absolutely had all of those books that Margaret just showed you. I had my shelf that had Dyke Strippers. I had the Liliane. I used to find her. I thought of them as zines, I guess, independently published stuff. There was always the cool Dépanneur or whatever in Montreal that would have her stuff with would be Vanity Fair and then her zines. So I grew up reading that stuff, but it seemed very remote. And actually, so I did not ever expect to work in comics. I only really got to work in comics because of my connection with a non-queer publishing organization called Kiss Machine, which was a small literary zine in Canada that was run by a woman named Emily Poweary, who was really invested in women artists, was invested in the idea of giving women opportunity to work in comics, which is how Jillian Tamaki, my cousin, and I came to be able to make Skim, which was originally published by Kiss Machine as a mini comic. So really, actually, for a long time, moving into comics for me was moving into a sort of straighter world, was moving into sort of, working with, I really didn't see it as a queer space, although there were certainly queers there and I was there. And even I think Skim, our first comic, while definitely being queer, was not really didn't really seem like it was part of the sort of queer publishing world, I guess, because that's how I saw queer work, was that it was published by small queer presses, and our first publisher, Groundwood Books, wasn't a queer press. So I think it's taken me a while to sort of get back into feeling like I am a sort of queer cartoonist, or not cartoonist, queer comic book writer. And a lot of that has been through rediscovering queer, I don't hang out with queer comics people the way I hung out with queer artists at Buddies when I was in my 20s, but I have sought out queer artists and queer comic book makers as an adult and as a person that's part of this industry. And I mean, if, in part just because it is such a kind of unique experience to work in this industry as a queer person, especially, for example, working for Marvel and DC Comics as a queer person. And really a lot of that has been helped by going to FlameCon. FlameCon to me is the gayest I ever am is at FlameCon. I feel the smell of people in, queers in in cosplay is one of my favorite smells. It's a very It just
Might be
feels
a lot
very
of that.
loving and amazing. Yes, and it's been like a way for me to sort of reestablish what it means to feel like I'm part of a queer community. Um, and most recently, my girlfriend Heather Gold was like, you should start a queer imprint. Like she was like, you are, you know, you love queer writers, you love queer cartoonists, like you are obviously invested in doing this. Like, what if that was something else that you did? And so, as of I think 2 years ago, I'm working on an imprint with Abrams called Shirley Books, which is actually a very queer enterprise. It's a lot of queers working with me. And it's been an opportunity to sort of like, albeit still virtually, kind of bring together a bunch of artists and writers that I love who are queers, and really sort of think very explicitly about what it means to sort of put more queer work out there and support queer artists, which is like, you know, for me, part of being a community is being a fan, but also being a supporter of sort of what's happening now, like not just by buying books, but by, yeah, like trying to find ways to make more books happen. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Thank you for making more books happen. I love it.
Thank you.
And our next panelist, Justin Hall.
Hello, everybody. This is really, thank you for having me on this. And like, these are some of my favorite people in the world. So this is really exciting to have a conversation with my people. Uh-oh, this is my this is my erotic series, Hard to Swallow, which I did with Dave Davenport. So I do erotic comics as well as a bunch of other stuff. I'm a big fan of erotic comics, and I sort of like doing that work as well. But in terms of like, actually, Dave is my collaborator in this series was an important person for me because I always felt alienated from the gay community. And I came to San Francisco. I hated Cher, and I didn't like, I didn't want to like, I hated Cologne. I hated like all of it. I was an old punk rocker living in a squat in New York and, you know, doing a lot of drugs and whatever. So I remember coming to San Francisco and walking to the Hole in the Wall bar, which was the best bar in the world in the mid 90s. And they were playing punk, and this guy, Dave Davenport, who was a tattoo artist, completely, you know, covered in ink, and he was a comic geek. And I was like, oh, wait a second, like I can have something in common with gay guys besides a love of cock. Like, that's amazing. And so I think that, you know, actually helped bring me into a community. But when I started making comics, I think of myself as a sort of bridge generation between what Maggie was talking about with the early cartoonists from the 80s and 90s. I started at like 2001. And I immediately sort of launched myself into Comic-Con and some of these more mainstream places and helped try to bring, you know, queer comics over into those spaces. But so I'm sort of a bridge generation between the people who were shut out completely from those spaces, and then what's happening now, which is where, you know, people like Mariko can have like, you know, very successful careers within broader kind of spaces within comics. And I do find that transition fascinating right now. So No Straight Lines, this book that I put together of earlier comics, queer comics, and went through kind of digging through different archives to find this material. It is definitely kind of looking back and trying to pay homage to this work. I was worried because so much of it was published and distributed and serialized within the insular world of queer media. It was published by queer publishers, distributed by queer distributors, sold in gay and feminist bookstores, and all of that, and serialized in queer newspapers. A lot of that material was in danger of being lost, and is in danger of being lost, as Maggie mentioned, because so much of that that world is falling apart. We're losing the gay bookstores and feminist bookstores and publishers and such. So some material will never, a lot of material is able to kind of jump over into the mainstream. I think with the help of places like FlameCon, which is a sort of, it's, you know, very much by and for community, but it's also sort of accessible to broader swaths of the population than a sort of random punk zine would be. And some of the material won't really make the transition well, like How to Paisan Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist. hard to imagine it going completely mainstream. But on the other hand, Alison Bechdel was able to do Fun Home and become Time Best Book of the Year and really sort of make that transition. And I find it really fascinating how this insular queer comics community, which is wonderful. I mean, everybody, I'm making a film right now based on No Straight Lines, No Straight Lines, The Rise of Queer Comics. And we're almost finished, which is great. It's going to debut this summer. And I was able to, film with Howard Cruz before he died. We were able to film with Allison, with Jen Camper, Rupert Kennard, and sort of get their experiences about trying to create material during this time period when so many doors were shut to them. But then also looking forward and realizing that, my students, so many of my students are queer and making queer work. It's really remarkable. And then also there's the spaces are broader and more available for us. So I just created a series of comics posters along Market Street in San Francisco commemorating queer history from 1955 to 1970, all these different moments in San Francisco history kind of leading up to Stonewall. So here's an example of one of them, since I don't have a fancy slide, but I've got a fancy, this was a proof. It's only half the size. It's actually twice the size. In reality, it's in the bus kiosk. And this is commemorating the Compton's Cafeteria riots, which were these riots where a number of trans women, drag queens, and gender nonconforming sex workers who were on the streets in San Francisco rebelled against the cops and had a riot, a couple of days of rioting. And this was 3 years before Stonewall, right? So it's an example of queer history being, completely whitewashed out, not talked about, swept under the rug. And now I can, illustrate these moments in comics and put them, along the thoroughfare of San Francisco for everyone to see. That would have blown my mind when I started making queer comics. I couldn't have even imagined that, having access to that kind of space. So the world has really changed, and a lot of it is because of people like Nick and Mariko kind of helping break open those doors. And Maggie, thank you for and Andre, thank you for like being academics that also support this kind of work. So yeah, that was my ramble.
Thanks so much. It's a fun ramble. You should be able to see from the web a version of the Compton's Cafeteria Riots poster that Justin just mentioned. And I love that this is a thing that exists in real life, especially right now. So much of what we see and what we can do for each other is virtual. It's great to know that if you are in the physical place where it is, this is something there in public for you. I think that's really great. And for the time being, I want to keep it up for a moment because I think it's really important for us to just to use the art forms and the knowledge that we engage with to know our ancestors in this way. So I want to open it up to some discussion among the panelists. First, there's a question in the Q&A, but first I wanted to know if you have questions for each other.
I actually do have a question. I was thinking of maybe for starting with Maggie, but anyone can jump in. So Maggie, the two of us have a friend, Ramsey Fawaz, and who does also academic work around comics, he does work on stuff on like a more mainstream superhero comics, and I remember having this discussion with him where he was talking about how he wasn't that interested in the biographies of the artists and writers who created the work. Like he was like, I don't really care where they came from. I'm interested in the work itself and how it sort of, is digested and consumed and imagined by the broader readership and broader society as pop cultural icons and all this and the material itself. But I wonder how you approach this as an academic. It seems to me that makes a lot more sense with material that has a sort of broad cultural impact as opposed to these sort of underground material where marginalized voices or creators are speaking to other marginalized readerships. But I wonder how you think of it. Do you dig into the biographies of the people who are you're researching, or do you just care about the work itself?
I mean, I'm super biographical, but I think that's also, I'm taking a lead from the work in that a lot of this work is autobiographical, semi-autobiographical, you know, in really important ways, but sometimes, you know, there's only so far we can go. So a lot of my work so far has been on Alison Bechdel, but part of that is she's very easy to trace. Her papers are at uh, you know, Smith College. Her publisher's papers are at Cornell. Um, you know, she's documented her own work in the indelible Alison Bechdel. I knew exactly where she had started cartooning, but like through going through her and sort of thinking through my method, I started to find these other artists. But there's like even in one of the early issues of Gay Comics, it might be 2 or 3. There's a trans artist in there doing their work. I don't know even in Gay Comics 25, there's very little information on who this person was. Did they
Yeah,
do further
David Cutler,
comics?
right?
Yeah,
David Cutler. I'm Me. I think it's a number 3 or something. And
yeah.
I was never able to find him.
Okay, because I was like, you know, and then people fall off the map. Like Jen Camper was telling me a few years ago, like Andrea Natalie is sort of hasn't been doing work at all. No one knows where she is, and I'm like, and she's a you know, lesbian artist, but also a woman of color who starts this important network of lesbian cartoonists. And is really good at titling her comics, like I told you earlier. But like, I think, you know, all the bios and stories, those all matter because they matter to the comics. They also matter to the networks. So it's sort of the material is different. So you know, I think you should always let the material and the artists speak to you and help determine your method rather than externally posing something on it as a scholar, which seems, I don't know, wrong. Anyway.
I mean, to me, it's interesting. One of the things that I find, especially like looking at your work, it makes me think of like, there's sort of like a period where people would sort of identify other people or themselves as like the first queer something in comics, or, you know, the first person to do or write anything. And I'm very wary of that descriptor, because I think the thing about queer comics especially is how much of it was self-published, how much of it was self-produced. And to say that you were the first person to work at a place that had a photocopier, or to, you know, like go and spend like $8 making like, you know, 100 copies of whatever you've done, like that is the thing with queer comics, is that it is so hard to sort of pinpoint, like, or that so much of the work was lost. Even some of the things that I remember reading when I was, you know, in my 20s in Montreal, that I've never been able to find, you know, because it was just like somebody making, you know, like a 2-page photocopy of like their comic book. But that is also, you know, and I think versus like, you know, in terms of like the sort of not queer publishing with the sort of validation of like a publisher, which has like this sort of like ISBN public record of the thing that you've done, is that there is just this long history of people self-producing, and people, which is, you know, also connected to the history of comics anyway, of like, I am my editor, I am my publisher, I am like, you know, artist, writer, everything, and I sort of like put this out into the world.
There's also the question of, you know, how much do we pay attention to sort of international? I mean, you know, there's global production of this kind of work. You know, Roberta Gregory in the foreword to Winging It, which is a really remarkable science fiction graphic novel that I highly recommend people to check out. It's really pretty wild. And she just kind of self-describes it as the largest graphic novel kind of a project done to that point by a woman, self-published by a woman. And she's probably right in the West. I mean, again, as Mariko said, like who knows exactly, right? I mean, you know, what basement are we gonna, you know, uncover at some point and realize that there was like some amazing lesbian cartoonist, you know, creating this like underground masterpiece and nobody really saw it. But you know, she's probably right. But then at the same time, she had no idea that in Japan, you know, Hotomagio and Keiko Takamiya had been doing, you know, Heart of Thomas and all these like massive books, you know, years before she started her work. So, you know, there's, I get, that is a question I have, I think about like, how much do we think kind of globally with this idea of community and production?
Yeah. Well, and also to reflect the global realities of what it means to be queer in countries outside of Canada and the United States, right? Like that it would be, even in terms of what, you know, what is defined as queer comics. I mean, I think it's really interesting too, because so much of, you know, like the style of it here is so much like the long history of these very autobiographical, confessional memoir comics, right? Like, and how much that is the sort of, you know, like the telling of queer, individual queer histories, which is so much a part of it here. But, you know, I don't know if it's the same in other countries, because also, you know, it's a harder thing to say what your reality is, and if there's fewer words to explain your reality, then like what kind of work do you produce in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that work that was being, the queer work that was being published early in Japan was oftentimes BL, boy love, which were, you know, made by women about queer male experiences, kind of, which, you know, that's a whole nother like kettle of fish, you know?
Yeah.
I was also going to say to this issue of framing things as being the first or the biggest. This is actually something that kind of comes up when we talk, the ways in which we talk about FlameCon. You know, in years past, it is a truth. To the best of our knowledge, we are the largest queer convention. But I think, and I don't think that is, that doesn't, to me, like promoting that feels maybe like it doesn't exactly line up with a queer ethos of community and sharing. And to me, like my work, people may never know who I am. They may never see me on the floor, like the convention floor, and that's fine, because I think that like the thing that drives my work is creating the space, not necessarily like a kind of promotion. However, when we talk to people outside of the community, sponsors, or you know, like then that becomes a form of recognition. Oh, we're the largest, we're maybe not the first, or and so it's code switching. It's queer code switching for me. You know, it's like it's not important to me, and I can see that, you know, certainly in the works of other people. First, biggest, best, like that is less important, but depends on who you're speaking to.
Yes.
Heard.
Yeah.
I really like that. There's a question from the chat that actually I think does kind of raise this notion of to whom it's important. And the question is phrased when thinking about queer comics, but I actually want to like turn it in a slightly different direction to ask when reading comics and reading queer stuff, how important to you is the distinction between reading individual stories and characters and persons who are queer, and showing communities and histories through the comics and the stories they tell and what they depict, or where they come from? Because we're all readers of comics too.
Well, I think, for example, like, and actually I was talking with another group of graduating students about this recently, like the sort of like the history of the coming out story, right? Which is the story of a person who is not part of a community, who is sort of like, you know, discovering their queer identity within the context that is not necessarily always hospitable to that. And, you know, like, you know, coming out into the world as like a queer person in contrast to like everything else. And I think that that story to me has always been, I mean, I don't want to invalidate anybody's story, and I know that those stories are a part of queer histories, but also it feels like that there has been, as a result of that, and also because I think of the sort of legibility of that story to straight audiences, there's been less stories about someone who is just queer and has other queer friends, and, you know, like, you know, and I think part of it also is like the extent to which like not queer audiences are comfortable with the amount of sexuality that would be involved in like talking in a story about like a queer community. And I think that that has definitely been a motivator for me, is to write stories about queer spaces as opposed to just queer individuals. It's like the gay friend, like it's like I think my friend Zoe Woodall told a joke about like, why do you always have these like gay characters who have like all these straight groups of people who have the one gay friend? Like, what is that one gay friend doing there with all these other straight people, right? Like, wouldn't you have other places, much cooler places to be than with like
But he's there to make the cool gay jokes.
yeah. He's there to be sassy. He's there for the sass. Now I think it is like, it's like this translation of a queer experience into a space that is not queer versus, you know, the nuances and and also even like I think the conflicts, right? Like it creates queerness as this amorphous, like we all agree, and you know, if you're queer, you know that's 100% not true. So
Yeah, that point actually reminds me that in like my formative experiences reading comics, it was that sense of community that's depicted in comics that really kind of sparks my interest and my desire to read more. Like it's cool to know that the creator of something is queer and that this is a world that's open to people like me and people I care about, but it's amazing to see real or fictitious, right, in superhero worlds, when queer characters recognize each other and live in worlds full of people like them. That to me is so much more authentic. I think that's very much part of the contemporary discourse on like diversity and reimaginations of mainstream comics. What I think can be lost there when queer and new people of color are introduced in mainstream comics is that we don't get to see something that is both authentic and fantastic, which is that people of color come from communities of people like us and live in them and know them. And when we are in contact with other kinds of people is when you get those conventional mainstream stories. But for me, growing up, the comics that saved my life, Milestone Comics, especially Blood Syndicate by Ivan Velez, shout out, and Tales of the Closet, and then later on through Queers in Comics, getting to know Rupert Kennard and seeing BB and the Diva, recognizing that Black gay people live with and come from Black people, and Black queers recognize each other and form community together. That stuff, when the stories are good, really shows something authentic, whether it's fictitious or not.
right.
I love the. I was just going to mention Rupert Kennard. I was thinking of all these different, like, community productions. I mean, people, I remember in the 90s in interviews with Alison Bechdel, people were always telling her, sometimes when I was coming out, I learned about what lesbian community was like through your comics. I'm also thinking of, like, there's also, I love Tim Barella's work. It doesn't get enough. Leonard and Larry, and they have the two of them have this whole sort of world in West Hollywood, of all these like queer friends. And then they're also, since one of them was formerly married, they have interactions with like the straight ex-wife and the kids. Um, but also Wendell, Howard Cruz's Wendell, and sort of like these sort of uh, like is important to represent an individual, but is even more important, I think, in some ways to represent a community and engagement with the community and being able to. So, I mean, just echoing and amplifying what you were just saying, Andre, like 100%.
And I do feel that like queer comics like that are essentially made by and for queer people and for queer audiences that can they can dive into the complexities around community and celebrate and also analyze and critique queer identities and communities in ways that are just not appropriate or are going to be done poorly in more mainstream work, right? I mean, when North Star came out as a gay superhero, then I think they immediately tried to make him sick, and he was going to like basically have AIDS, like the one queer character, yeah. And then it was turned. I think there was some pushback, and it was turned into like a space plague.
Space plague.
Damn space plague.
But at the same time, you've got, during that time period, you've got, remarkable work by the people that Maggie's talking about, and Burton Clark, we mentioned earlier, doing critiques of, Burton Clark's Cyrus and the Snow Queen syndrome, which was in early pages of gay comics, and he's tackling issues around internalized racism within gay men, which is just like, okay, there's really complex stuff around identity and community that would be really poorly done in the pages of Superman. We need queer comics. Even now, we need queer comics. Even as kind of queer characters are more accepted in mainstream productions, there's stuff that's not appropriate to do in the mainstream, and stuff's really supposed to be done by our community for ourselves.
Yeah, even just the notion that there's this sort of trope of explaining queerness to a not queer person in a where you're like, this is how I identify, and like this is what this is, as opposed to the sort of constant work within the community that's happening around definitions and how those things are not static, and that those things are like part of the sort of daily life of being a member of the queer community. I think it's very yeah, I think the sort of evolution of that is part of depicting queer communities, and way more interesting than just like like the conversation where you go to your mom and inevitably you get like, can you explain this to me question, and then you do your very best to do that. Or my mom, I don't know what you do with your mom.
I think our time is running short, so I wanted to maybe leave us, as I often do, thinking about the future. And I'll just ask everyone, what's next for you, or what are you hoping for in the near future?
I spend a lot of my time thinking about the future. At this point, 8 months out. I'd really like to know what the summer in New York is going to look like. Certainly when planning a large scale event. But I think either way, the ways that we've seen our communities change, well, right, like who is better at adapting to change on few resources than queers and people of color and other marginalized folks who have to do a lot with a little. So for me, the thing that has been really heartening to see is our move toward accessibility. And obviously I spend a lot of time thinking about physical spaces, but how does community translate digitally? And I think there are, that conversation is changing quickly, but I see more people invested in that. So yeah, so I'm excited, but I don't know what the future holds. Do any of us?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I have a couple books coming out, and I'm very curious to see what that's going to look like. I am not Starfire with DC Comics, with Yoshi Yoshitani, which I'm very, very excited about, and a book that was just announced with my cousin Jillian Tamaki. That will be our first collaboration in a while that we actually both wrote together, which is really amazing. And then on the other side, I'm also writing Dark Detective, which is for DC Comics and illustrated by Dan Mora. And I'm the thing that I'm really, the most excited about is these books that are going to be coming out with Shirley Books. As we kind of get them all ready, and to see, I'm very excited to see sort of every day, like when different projects come to us and I see what different queer artists are interested in and the stories that they're interested in telling, and looking at, what is the priority for new generation of writers. I'm very excited for those books.
I'm going to be this film No Straight Lines is coming out in the summer. We're debuting at a really major film festival, which is going to be announced fairly soon, which I'm feeling very, very validated after years of grueling work. I'm never making another film again. It's ridiculous. I'm sticking with comics, but it's going to be really wonderful to see people like Rupert and Mary Wings and Allison and Jen, and Howard in particular, because Howard Cruz, for those of you who don't know, pick up Stuck Rubber Baby. He was like, not only, normally you don't want to meet your heroes because they're awful, but sometimes you meet your heroes and they're like as beautiful as the work is, and that was Howard. So if we can have this film sort of help cement his legacy as I think one of the greatest cartoonists ever, then that's a project well spent. And then I'm working on turning these posters into a book as well, and working on teaching. And at CCA, we have the MFA in Comics program, and we're becoming sort of more international with that, expanding the cohort out. I've got a lot of we've got a lot of plans. So I'm really excited about that work too.
I was gonna say I'm super excited about the documentary. Also, I was like a Kickstarter person, so I've been like watching, I'm super thrilled. But one of the things that's foremost on my mind right now is how to move 2 cats cross country without traumatizing them and make an outdoor cat and indoor cat in San Francisco. But I'm gonna be spending like the next year just like digging into histories of queer comics in San Francisco, but also hopefully earlier this summer in South Florida, there's a archive there called the Stonewall Archive, which started in upstate New York, but is in South Florida. So just trying to sort of figure out how to, do justice to these histories, but also think about sort of the communities and the networks and all the people who serve are on the periphery and get forgotten. So I feel very blessed to have all that time to just basically sit and like look through comics and things like that.
I can't say when the next time I'm gonna teach a class on comics will be, but it will probably be soon. And I will definitely teach comics in any classes because I get to do that and it's kind of amazing. But I am gonna be in conversation with some lovely people at the Berkeley Fandom and New Media Conference in a couple weeks. I've gotta like get my Zoom schedule together to know exactly what the scope of the conversation will be. But I think it's bcnm.berkeley.edu has all of their events. And eventually later, more writing about comics will be part of what I'll do in some subsequent projects that I'm like tentatively committed to. But more in the vein of kind of combining these histories and legacies of queer people of color in superhero comics and some of these broader questions about like where we see ourselves on the broader media landscape and histories that we haven't been able to pay as much or devote as much attention to in the mainstream, so that we don't always feel like someone has to be or has to know that they're first, and so that no one has to feel like they're first, because that's not necessarily what we're all here for. We're here to feel welcomed, in addition to feeling like it's okay to go first when it's time for that. I think we managed our time like amazingly well, and we have a couple of minutes. I'll of course monitor the chat, but how is everyone doing? Are you good?
I'm so glad that we did this. I was like, oh,
Ooh.
it's going to be so early, but this was really great. It was really, I mean, I'm really glad that we talked so much about old comics and all that stuff, because it's you know, I'm a lapsed academic, so I love that stuff. So was very happy, and we also has made me very excited at the possibility of FlameCon happening soon. So
It will
that's also awesome.
in some form or fashion. Where
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
We'll all be at FlameCon for sure.
Yes.
That's, yeah.
Every decent T-shirt I own is from someone who sold it to me at FlameCon. So
Fun question in the chat. Are there any up and coming queer comics and creators or things that are coming out that any of y'all are excited about?
I can mention I just finished reading Bishak Som's Spellbound.
Spellbound. I just bought that.
Wonderful.
Oh, I can't wait.
It's so cool. And so she just came out. She earlier come out with Apsara Engine, which is a collection of short stories.
Which is beautiful.
So beautiful.
That's actually one of her works right there.
Oh, you got an original. Ooh,
yeah.
Jealous. So Bishak, I think, is one of the like just rising superstars, and it's really cool that, you know, so the Spellbound is a sort of magical realism version of a memoir about her making Apsara Engine. So I love that sort of meta thing going on, and yeah, check out her work. She's amazing.
Well, the two first books that were coming out for Shirley Books are the first is Flung Out of Space, which is Patricia Highsmith, sort of fantasia, I guess. It's not a biography, but it's a sort of imagining. And a lot of it actually talks about Patricia Highsmith's connection to comics, because she wrote comics. And it's by Grace Ellis and Hannah Templer. And then we also have this very wicked book that I have a deep affection for, Lifetime Passes, which is about, amongst other things, the fact that if you go to this theme park and somebody in your party dies at the theme park, that everybody in the group gets lifetime passes. And it's by Terry Blass and Claudia Aguirre. So those are our two first Shirley books, and I'm very excited about them. The art is in now. It's very exciting, and I hope people really love them too.
I haven't gotten it yet, but I'm super excited about the Baileys issue 1. So it's like the Bay Area artists, like 22 of them, cartoonists of color and queer cartoonists in anthologies. I mean, one of the things, the great things too about like queer comics too, is there's anthologies is so often like, an important format, but it's also like really just like, I feel like it works so much better and is so much more powerful in sort of queer community comics and other ones. So I think it's on its way soon. There's a Kickstarter, but I'm not quite sure, but I can't wait to read it.
That was actually put together by 2 former students of mine, Lawrence Lindell and Brina Nunez, and I did a page in it. So it's always sort of wonderful reversal when your former students are now employing you. So, it's going to be a great book.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled.
I'm writing all these down, by the way. That's what's happening.
Yeah. I'm always torn between like, ooh, now I have a chance to read comics from 10 years ago that I haven't been able to catch up with, and oh my gosh, this is coming in a few months. I can't, I'm gonna like wait for this.
Also, Instagram, I feel like it's a great space for a lot of queer artists. When I was doing my queer comics class, I was trying to think of like folks to include. I just went through my Instagram and be like, who am I reading here? I was like, I ended up teaching like Grease Pats, which comes out in
Yes.
Auto Straddle, which is fantastic whenever it comes
Yeah.
out. And there's been some really great quarantine themed strips about like the Zoom
Yes.
life from a queer perspective that I really appreciate.
Yeah.
But yeah, Instagram, I think, is a great place for, you don't have to super commit to everything, but you get to like see the artist and then start to consume their work other places too.
Yeah. Archie's doing a book with us too.
Really?
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm trying to think of anything else I've read recently that's been queer and amazing. There's just so many. I do think that the sort of like Instagram format that lets you swipe through mini comics is like, works really well. People are making really cool stuff.
It's great. It's in a way, it's I feel like it gives me a chance to get on board with the next lap of like web comics, because I was terrible at following comics via like Tumblr and stuff. But now I'm like, oh, if I subscribe to your Instagram, I will see it. And that's actually an excellent way to see the content that people are making. Again, like conveniently most of the time.
It's changing comics too. People are starting to do more of these sort of come back to sort of standard panels in order to kind of fit it onto an Instagram feed, which is fascinating. We're getting a lot more students interested in making comics essentially from the phone. Yeah.
Well, I think that you have managed your time perfectly. I appreciate that. That was a really great conversation. Again, thank you so much to Andre for organizing, and thank you all for participating. We got a lot of great engagement on our stream and really illuminating conversation. We are coming up for a big break because our keynote scholar is Deborah Whaley, and she will be talking at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you have a little bit of time to stand up, stretch, maybe go outside if you're in Michigan, but elsewhere, go outside and orient yourself. And then we'll be back at 12 for a great keynote from our keynote scholar, Deborah Whaley. So once again, thank you to our great roundtable on LGBTQ plus in comics. This was awesome. Thank you so much for participating in the MSU Comics Forum Online 2021. You made it happen. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre.
Thanks,
Nice
everyone.
meeting everybody. I'm going back to bed now. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.